everyone. Welcome back to Deep Data Dive. We're your co-hosts, Laura and Vijay. This is part 2 of our episode of how to get into data science with our guest, data scientist Jonathan Bechtel. This was like a really nice, really interesting discussion that we had with him, but it became really, really long. So that's why we decided to break it up into 2 different episodes to make it more manageable for everybody. So without further ado, here's part 2. And here in part 2, we will discuss the job application process for data science, as well as what it's like applying for data science jobs now versus what it was like 3 or 4 years ago.
But
yeah. So I guess my first question, I guess this is for both of you, is did any of your programs offer career services to like help one get their first job out of whatever program?
General Assembly does. So if you go into their full-time program, so not if you do part-time or if you just take one of their classes or things like that, but if you do full-time, they do actually have like career services, and they kind of help you go ahead and prep. I can't say too much about what they do with specific employer relationships and things like that, like if they have like a pipeline there. But I knew they actually do put in quite a bit of effort, like 3 months after you leave the program, to make sure you can actually go ahead and then you're just actually going through the rounds and going through necessary steps and getting coached through the whole process.
All right. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. So at Stevens, the school has the career services, but my own department had their own events too. They had quite a few networking events in the evening with food, drinks, and people coming in, both people from industries, and there were some presentations sometimes from people. Well, there were also different talks about data science and the topics, and there was also an annual poster competition, and that's when the students build posters for their final class projects in a semester, and people from different industries come to the event, and that's another networking opportunity. Besides that, there are summer internships that people do, and there's a little bit of a network with that, with people towards the end of the program, helping out people in the beginning, and there's a little bit of an alumni reach as well. I'm just trying to think very quickly if I missed anything. I think at a high level that pretty much covers that. I graduated in the summer, and that might have been a disadvantage because I did the job search on my own, and it took me about 6 months after graduation, and I still think that's a good number, and even anybody who would take 6 months after Insight, I think that's a very good for them, despite what they might personally believe, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, so that was the nice thing, is that Insight does help out with career support. So, they had services for helping you with resume. My program director would very generously agree to mock interview me. Thank you very much. So those things were always really nice. And then the thing was the program was officially only 7 weeks, but a lot of fellows stuck around afterward just to do interview prep and all of the other things associated with trying to get a job at data science. So, while Insight does boast that they have a very high placement rate, it can take a while to find that first job. And I think it took me at least good 5 months after Insight ended before I found my first job and started my first job. So by then I think maybe at least half my cohort had at least found their first jobs. So it was something initially a bunch of the fellows would find their first job about a month after Insight, and then there was a long tail of all of the other people who take longer to find that first job. So it can take quite a while. I knew someone who was searching for almost a year, but eventually everyone at Insight does find employment in data science, which is very nice. But I guess that is the other thing, is that it can take a while to find that first job.
Yeah, the first job can be difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is one thing we all agree on.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees on that.
Yeah. So, and I know, I guess, they're just touching upon like, like one of the biggest components is always the technical screening. And that's like the part where if you go for any job, whether it's like a take home assignment that you get to do on your own time versus like a technical, like timed interview, either in person or on Zoom, where someone asks you technical questions. Like, did any of your respective institutions give guidance or preparation for those?
I would say, to answer your question narrowly, not exactly, because I don't believe General Assembly like will literally kind of put you through paces. So like you have like a 90-minute technical screen, things like that. And so this is the kind of stuff that they go ahead and put you through. My feeling there is most students are pretty well prepared for kind of what to expect, roughly speaking, things like that, because, you'll be asked questions. Sometimes they could be more theoretical, about kind of like some properties, of like, ordinary least squares regression or things like that. Other times, it's more vocational, because can you basically transform data in like any particular way, using like a data processing library, things along those lines. And so it seems like there's kind of enough common knowledge that even though like the staff at GA doesn't explicitly do that, usually people are pretty well prepared for it, I think, going into it. And so usually after they graduate from the program, kind of prepping themselves in kind of like a leak code-ish kind of way, to get ready for the technical screens is usually something I think those people are pretty much already prepped for by the time they're getting ready to go into the job applications.
Very cool. So although there's alumni mentors now after I finished the program, I think that's the way how people help each other. But when I was there, there wasn't really any formal technical interview preparation. And that's something that I learned on my own, pretty much the hard way, doing it independently over the summer, because as I mentioned, I was one of the lone people who did the summer, and that's my story.
Yeah. Yeah, the technical interview was always like really tricky. At least at Insight, they actually did a lot to prepare us for this. So towards like the second half of the program, we'd have like weekly data challenges that would be like different topics. And they would ask us, it would be something like a take home where it'd say like, here's this problem, here's this data. What are some insights that you can draw from this? And then we also had like alumni mentoring, and you can sign up for really any sort of technical interview with alumni at different times, and they'll like ask you the questions. And this was sometimes in person, sometimes it was over like Google Hangouts or Zoom. So we were kind of semi-remote before the pandemic, somewhat.
Ahead of your time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that was they emphasized a lot.
One thing I think that's probably particularly challenging about like the technical screen, especially like going into your first job, right? I think coming out of your first job, you have some experience, and so you're a bit more pointed in like one direction or another, for what your specialties are. But like the first technical interview, I think it's really hard. Obviously, you don't have a specialty yet, and so most first-time hirees are probably happy just to get hired anywhere, things along those lines. And so they probably have more of like a shotgun approach versus the rifle approach. But a lot of times what companies are looking for from a data science position can vary quite a bit, and so, some companies, sometimes not necessarily advertising it as such, might really emphasize, like a good grasp of statistical fundamentals, and experimental design and things like that to measure like, experimental effects or, and that kind of stuff. Others, like if you work in like supply chain or logistics, they might advertise for data science, but like what they might really want is specialty in something like optimization, or like operations research and that kind of stuff, and network routing. And so they're like, that's actually kind of like a narrow subset, right, of like the data science, ecosystem. And so I think it's easy to kind of be blindsided a little bit, just kind of going into it the first time, because companies are just going to come at you with very different things depending on whatever their particular business use case is. And so I think most first timers are not very well prepared for that. It's kind of difficult to go through enough like rounds until you kind of get used to basically finding a good match, who's looking for something that you want, because you're not really experienced or differentiated enough to really make those decisions for yourself. And so I've just noticed for like lots of times people who are kind of going through the interview process for the first time, it's pretty common experience, because they might want to know something about like how you might handle Docker, or, like your experience with like a big data technology, or, again, like you want to like particular aspects of linear regression, or statistical insight. And so I think it's usually one of the biggest things for newcomers in the industry to kind of just get through.
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree with you, because one of the things that I encountered was interviewing with a particularly large retailer was, it seemed like a lot of people in their data science division came from that operations research background. And what they really wanted was someone who was good at, doing optimization work, especially with regards to like maybe how they wanted to like stock their warehouses or fulfillment centers. Like topics of that sort, which was very kind of specific to them, and maybe some other retailers posed a question that I still to this day know.
I actually remember talking to you about that a couple years ago. But actually, if you actually look at like opening job descriptions, things like that, it's not very common, but maybe like 10 to 15%, right, of like data science positions are kind of like nestled inside like that kind of particular like analytical category, of like linear programming or optimization or whatever. And it's just one example. I'm not saying it's sort of like, that's the only thing you can do, but like, even if you study data science for a long time, if you haven't really taken your time to go over something like that, you'd probably be blindsided,
Yeah.
And then I know some other it's actually, I think it's fairly common for people coming out of going into data science, not really having like a lot of experience with something like Databricks, or Spark or whatever. But for certain companies, fluency with that is going to be like the most important thing for whether or not they feel comfortable bringing you on, and things like that. And so you can kind of slice up the pie, a dozen different ways, kind of these little micro skill sets and things like that. And so it's just, I actually don't think there's a good answer to navigate around it. You can kind of be a little more selective in terms of, what kind of companies you apply for. But I think usually if you're getting your first job, you're just happy to get whatever you can, and things like that. And so you'd be happy to work for like a retail company, or, like a web, a B2B software app or whatever, so just as long as you can kind of get a taste of the field itself. So I just think there's a mismatch. It's just hard. I have my own experience doing something similar. It's not fun,
Yeah.
but I think you just have to get through it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess, just touching upon maybe like some last topics. I know like Jonathan and Vijay, I know you guys have sort of been in this field for a while longer than I have. So I guess the big question is like, how do you think applying into like a data science job now is different versus what it was like 3 or 4 years ago?
Vijay,
you go.
All right.
Thanks, I've been going first the whole night. I'll let you go first. Sorry.
That's very nice of you.
No problem.
How is it different now versus 3 versus 4 years ago? So at a high level, there's a lot more technology now. There's a lot more people who want to get into the space now. There's a lot more jobs. And with all of that, I see that things are a lot more specialized, and that there are more opportunities, much more, but the standards are much more specific. So getting a single job is much harder, but there's more opportunities to try. And going to what you talked about, Jonathan, and you talked about Laura with the OR and LP example, different industries have different requirements, and there's no ISO definition for what a data scientist entails, because some companies think that it's just getting insights and making business decisions. Others think it's straight up machine learning. Others think that there is some software development integrated within that. And in terms of going back to the question in terms of how it changed, because 3-4 years ago, there were whiteboard coding problems. There were statistical questions. There were questions about the industry, people's backgrounds, and there still are those questions, but now I would say with the statistics questions, there's more details in terms of what the algorithms do and how to get different calculations like loss metrics, for example. And in terms of the whiteboarding, there's a bigger push of getting to the optimal solution or knowing, well, it kind of varies like what data structures are being asked. Some people sometimes care about trees, some people care about dynamic programming, and I think that's changing now, but that's my takeaway. And John, if you have any thoughts, I'd like to hear what you think, and then we can continue this discussion.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, so there's maybe kind of like two ways to kind of think about how it's changed. One is actually how companies hiring data scientists have changed, compared from like 4 years ago, to current day right now. So I think one thing is, I actually would definitely agree that like hiring for data science right now, it's a little more specific and differentiated than it was like 4 or 5 years ago, because data science is still like a big and important field, things like that. I think it still kind of makes like the top 10 list, of like, most, attractive jobs and things like that, whatever. And so I think the whole like data is new oil stuff is still generally true. It's also true though, like what data science means, right, for a particular industry is definitely going to be very different from like one example to the next. And so I think companies have kind of gone beyond, well, we just need like a data science team and things like that because we're investing in our future, to having I think probably a more clarified vision, of, we need someone who's like very well versed in time series analysis because, we need to be able to kind of continually make like these big forecasts at scale and that kind of stuff. So I would say companies tend to be both, I'd say, a little more focused in how they hire for things. So again, a little more narrow in terms of what they're looking for. And then also in terms of like the industry itself, I think the tooling has really expanded compared to like 3 or 4 years ago. And so I do think like a while ago, people were getting hired with like good, nice looking Jupyter notebooks and stuff like that. But I think now, going into the field, you really have to have some kind of demonstrated capability to take some kind of analytical process and then either being able to like attach it to a very specific data source, so like it could be like financial info, how to kind of like process it, and things like that. Or it could be like, again, a computing system that companies are used to working in, things along those lines. And so, and then being able to like port it out somewhere else. And so I would say kind of like the data ingesting and the deployment aspect has actually become more important for like the actual job and kind of getting in versus what it was like, maybe around 2015 or 2016. And so I think focusing on that part, like the tooling involved and kind of like work through like a full project from beginning to end, and then being a little more cognizant of how it might apply to a specific industry, I think is probably like the big evolutionary turns that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years. Because I think definitely now companies are less enthusiastic about hiring someone that can just kind of come in and like build a model, and then kind of like walk out, things like that. The modeling tools have gotten increasingly sophisticated, so that way, like the coding for it is it's kind of been commoditized a little bit. It's very general. Like if you work in Python, almost everything follows the scikit-learn API, things like that. And so learning how to learn like one, algorithmic library versus the other, it's usually not too difficult. But learning how to like integrate into a larger project is really important. And then the better you can kind of make that specific to an industry, the better off you are.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think I remembered something from maybe even 5 years ago. And back then there was a lot of emphasis on building algorithms from scratch. And I actually did that for a few assignments. But now going to what you said, Jonathan, it's more about knowing all the tooling and integrating the algorithm into the bigger picture. And scaling and putting into production.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I think it's kind of like the idea that like these days, like you might have like someone building out. I mean, I suppose it's possible in some companies, things like that. But it's like the amount of people who'd be expected to do that these days, I think it's pretty small, right? I mean, no one. I don't think too many data scientists are.
Nobody has ever asked me to do
yeah,
that.
Yeah. It wouldn't even really come into your job description at all. Yeah. But no, I tend to agree because I actually think like a while ago, even like among companies hiring data science, yeah, like we want like your knowledge of algorithms to be such that you can kind of like, build your own from the ground up, and like make sure it converges in a particular way, and kind of like build in these sorts of loss functions, things like that. And so knowledge of those things still helps, right? Like it's still like, you kind of have to have some like working understanding of those things. But the idea that like you wouldn't just use one of the standard libraries for at least maybe like 80% of your tasks, it seems pretty far-fetched to me for most people in most jobs.
Yeah. And I feel like at least for having the standard libraries, like sort of like everybody knows that like how they work and that they're like validated. So I guess it's from, a validation standpoint of like, if I had to write my own algorithm from scratch, like how will I know that it works as well? Works as I think it is. Like, I guess the question would be, have I validated it? And I guess that's something that you don't have to deal with if we all end up using the same packages that are basically now standard.
In fact, I think these days too, it's become increasingly common. Like a lot of times when I read, like if there's some new, algorithm that's maybe written in like a new language, like it was in R before and they wrote it, now they're writing in Python. Usually what they do is they use the algorithm from the other language as the reference, things like that. And they say, well, like the results, if you actually look for like the source code for like stats models, which is like a statistical library in Python, like a lot of stuff they'll actually mention that like if you run the same command in SAS, you'll get the same results and things like that. So I mean, even the people writing the software libraries themselves use the software libraries for validation. So yeah.
And I guess, going back to, what you said about, I guess, like, hooking things up to like a data source and like running them in production. That's definitely true, at least from what I've experienced. Was that I had a good friend who went into data science in 2017, and he also did Insight in 2017. And we were talking about our experiences, and he said that, when I was doing Insight, we really just only had to, show a Jupyter notebook. But when I did Insight, we had to be able to learn how to use like one of those EC2 instances from AWS, sign up with an AWS account, learn how to write a functioning front end using Flash so that we could show and demo what we had built during Insight on computer. So that was like, I definitely feel like, the requirements have gotten more specific, and they're like maybe more skills that you are expected to learn to become a data scientist. And the other thing that he told me was, it just seems like, like a lot of data science teams are starting to get, more like mature, and they're like more structured now. And like the teams know what they're looking for in a data scientist and what sort of data science problems they're looking to solve. And that's something that I'd always asked when I was on the interview trail, was like, what like problems are you looking to solve in this position? Or like, what does this team do? And they usually already have an answer, like, oh, our team wants to like optimize for this, or our team wants to expand this.
Yeah, totally. I definitely think like compared to previously, companies are kind of sticking their thumb in the wind a little bit, with data science and that kind of stuff, because they figured it was like an avenue for growth, without really realizing, with a lot of clarity, like what they need to use it for. But yeah, time has passed, things like that. They've seen like where this return good results and things like that. Yeah, and it's become much more articulated, for what you actually have to be able to do.
Yeah, and the job requirements have gotten like very specific.
Yeah, definitely. It's actually kind of interesting to read through job descriptions. I just like to peruse them, and things along those lines. And so, some things will be like really heavily in like, you need to be really familiar with like Bash and Unix and like Docker and Apache Airflow and, other stuff like that, and Kubernetes, which is all kind of like model deployment type stuff, and things along those lines, and like DevOps. That's more like an engineering centric role. Other ones, again, will be pretty careful about certain types of analytical techniques, like I think like actually a number of companies actually do like need like forecasting a lot, things along those lines. So they actually will want to know, a lot about, things like kind of like the full, not just maybe like data science per se, but like the full stack of like time series analysis techniques, you know, in terms of like the classical ones, like ARIMA, you know, or like whole winters, and then also some of the more specialized ones too, you know, like recurrent neural networks and that kind of stuff. And so, and on it goes. So.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I guess trying to think of something that was related to that. Yeah, I think sometimes when you look at some job descriptions, they can be kind of funny because I once found one that looked like it was like they wanted somebody who knew a whole amount of stuff about data science and at the same time a whole lot about like the engineering and DevOps. So I'm just like, dude, this is not a job description for one person. This is like a 3-person job.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think maybe like 20% of these job descriptions are actually written by people in HR, and they're just kind of creating wish lists, you know, for like their super data scientists and things along those lines. And so, yeah, that's kind of Pollyannish, and that you can kind of tell those ones too, you know, things like that. So ideally, you know, ML, AI, stats, preferably, you know, at least, you know, masters, but PhD is preferred, you know, 5 years of work experience. And then ideally the candidate, you know, is also familiar with a variety of cloud computing systems and, you know, Docker, Linux, Airflow, you know, Kubernetes. And then hopefully you have at least like a little bit of software engineering experience on the side, things like that. And so at least one like app development framework, you know, like you know, like Flask or Laravel and things along those lines. And so when you see stuff like that, so like literally you have to be like kind of everything all into one. And if it's for like the junior level job, you can kind of tell, right? It wasn't actually written by someone closely connected with them. They were not actually working, like they're not actually part of the data science team. But I think it's still generally true though. If you kind of read through, like they are a little more specific now for what they're looking for.
Yeah. I think that's a really useful tip just for anybody who's like interviewing and you actually make it to the stage where you get to interview with, you know, like a recruiter or hiring manager, somebody who works on the team is asked them like, what specifically do they do during like their jobs? Like what's the problem that they're trying to solve and what are the tools that they're asking for? Because that gives you a much more accurate picture of what you'll actually be doing in that job itself. Because like you said, job descriptions are sometimes written by people in HR and maybe
they're exceedingly big
of the reality on the ground.
Yeah, actually, sometimes I actually think like sometimes like HR people know as much about like the position as maybe like someone who's taking like an intro to data science workshop, you know, at General Assembly and things like that, where they've kind of read a lot about some buzzwords and that kind of thing, and they know kind of vaguely what it does, but you know, they kind of have like this alphabet soup of like kind of like different types of industry terms, but like no idea how it actually fit together.
Yeah. I feel like another thing that I've seen is among like data science like job descriptions now is that most jobs will require you to have some experience putting like a model into production and like deployment.
Yeah.
And that's a thing where if you don't have that experience, it can be sometimes hard to land that job.
I think so, yeah.
That's the thing that like literally everybody is looking for now.
In fact, I think in a lot of ways, if you can figure out how to put models into production, it's actually a good way to overcome maybe potentially a lack of academic pedigree, you know, if you didn't have it. So if you don't want to go down like the degree route and things like that, and like brushing up on your linear algebra, you know, it doesn't really sound like very fun to you and that kind of stuff. Like just kind of figuring out like a cloud system, you know, and things like that, how to like take like a model and like get it deployed as an API or something like that. It's like a really useful job skill to have, you know, for like catching the eye of like a hiring manager somewhere, you know. So actually a lot of ways, I would think one of the best ways you could use to maybe kind of like shortcut your way through the process and kind of give yourself a heads up in a way that'd be really relevant and like widespread. And again, wouldn't require like a lot of extra like, you know, mental cartwheels or hoop jumping on your part, would just be kind of figuring out how to put stuff into production.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. And with all the different cloud services, like there's a lot of tutorials now, and there's even 10-minute tutorials. There's documentation that's like really, it's become a lot easier over the years to learn those skills. And it's something that everybody should definitely check out.
Yeah. No, I think these days, in terms of maybe like how I could spend like a week of learning or something like that, kind of getting up like the very basics of like cloud production, things like that, they go a long way. Totally.
Yeah. Well, so I think that's all I had on my list of topics for discussion today. Are there any like last thoughts that you guys want to bring up?
Well, I would just like to say I had fun, and it was really great talking to the two of you. So hopefully we'll get to do it again.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I think I'm think I'm talked out for the evening, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Nice.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. It's
on the
your
show.
podcast, so thanks for having me on. So I had a good time, and so, yeah, no, I loved it. So thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you, listeners, for listening to us talk about getting into data science for like an hour. And well, thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. Thanks, Vijay,
Happy to be here.
Contribution. And yeah, once again, thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you in the next episode.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Am I safe to log off?
I'm going to stop the recording.
So Vijay, what do you think of having our guest Jonathan on the show?
Yeah, he was a real delight, and it's always great to hear someone else's perspective, and it's always great to validate my own thoughts about the field and your thoughts as well, and also challenge some of the things that we thought. But yeah, it was like a good flow because it's the first time we had three of us doing an episode, and it was pretty interesting. I took a few jabs at you, but
yes,
I don't know. It just happened.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it went really great. I am glad, we got to have our first guest on the show, and it was great hearing somebody else's different perspectives. So I thought it was nice that people could see like the different perspectives and the different paths that we took, because like I did a boot camp, you did a master's, and Jonathan self-taught. So you can see like what the challenges were that we each faced along the way, and like what our programs did a really good job of preparing us for, and what we maybe could have used a little bit more help with.
Yeah, it's very interesting because all this stuff, even like 10 years ago, it was all non-existent, and now here it is.
Yeah. And it's always good to see the perspective of people who've been in this field for like longer. Just because, I've only been working as a data scientist for maybe a little over 2 years. Maybe we'll call it close to 2.5 to 3 if we count Insight. But I know like you and Jonathan have been in this field a lot longer than I have. So it's interesting to see what's changed in this time.
Yeah. I think so too. And maybe I forgot to mention that you and we connected in 2017, and I talked, you asked me about getting into data science, and I gave you a little bit of advice, and we talked about how we both used Codecademy to learn Python, which I thought was pretty cool because I was doing that like on my own, and I never really talked to anybody about that before. So that was like a good common interest. And yeah, I think also going to my master's program, I did forget to mention that there were like weekend boot camps built into that program too, and that's probably like another interesting perspective because all these things aren't really mutually exclusive because everybody's self-taught. And Jonathan has an interesting perspective because he teaches the boot camps, and both you and I have done it in some capacity.
Yeah, so he's seeing like what works well for like people, like what type of skills do you have that would make you like a really good candidate for like full-time boot camp and things like that. And
I was going to say that a couple of years ago I went to this GTC conference by NVIDIA, and I sat through like a half-day class on learning Deep Learning NLP, Keras, TensorFlow, and TPUs, and that was pretty cool. And it was kind of like a boot camp, but like it goes into continuously learning. And I know you said you did something before the pandemic with AWS, and I think that reinforces the idea of like continuously learning, and it's almost like a boot camp environment throughout our careers.
Yeah, this was, I think, like right at the end of Insight, but before I got my job at Bridget, I took a 2-day sort of like AI ML boot camp in AWS at the AWS Loft in West Broadway down in Soho. So that was, like learning how to use the different AWS suite of tools in a bit more detail. I'm also pretty sure that since I don't use AWS at work, I've completely forgotten it all. Sorry, AWS.
Well, it keeps changing, right? Like I
Yeah.
think every few months or definitely every couple of years, the certification expires and one has to redo it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mentioned in another interview that I had someone mention, you know, you always have to learn new tools because there's always going to be a new one out and everybody uses a different thing every 2 years.
That's right. Now there's like companies doing multiple clouds, so it's not just one versus the rest anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, like I didn't learn how to use PySpark until I started my current job, but that was something that I had to learn for where I'm working now. I had like no experience in it, but I already knew my way around like Python and Pandas pretty well. And it takes some adjusting to get used to the syntax for PySpark, but you know, you get used to it, but that's just another part of the job. And I think that's going to be a recurring point, is that we're always going to talk about how you always need to be able to be self-taught to be successful in data science.
For sure. And yeah, I mean, I never had fun learning PySpark. I just wanted to use plain SQL. I know there's PySpark SQL as well.
Yeah. But again, I guess going back to the whole point of 2017, yeah, that's actually the year I met Jonathan, because he was teaching an intro to data science, like free course at General Assembly, and I showed up.
Very nice.
And then we talked about like the reproducibility crisis in science.
What's
So that was one of the few things I remember from when I first met him. And I know we were both talking about, you know, learning how to use Python from Code Academy. I should say right now, neither one of us is being paid by Code Academy to say that.
Well, at least not yet, but yeah.
It was a very useful class though. Like, you know, there are a lot of really great resources that are free online. So I think I used the Code Academy one. I think I used, I think they have a SQL class, and that's what I use to try to teach myself SQL. Isn't that Code Academy? And I think Data Camp also has a free introduction to Python class I think I took at some point.
Nice. I mean, there's like so many now. I think even Kaggle, well, Kaggle definitely has mini courses too, and all these different things.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I think it just about covers it. I personally think it was really great having a guest, and I hope we get to have more guests in the future on our podcast.
Of course. And yeah, it was a long recording, but it's a pleasant surprise. And even with the first 3 episodes, it went longer than we thought it would. I thought each episode back then would just be 10, 15 minutes.
But now you can go on for a while when you have a guest. But it's cool because it's always nice to hear what perspective other people bring based on the experiences that they have.
For sure.
Yeah. So here's hoping that we'll have more guests in the future. And, you know, once again, you know, thanks to Jonathan for joining us on our podcast. Thanks, Vijay, for co-hosting. And, you know, our audience, thank you so much for listening. And we'll see you in the next episode of Deep Data Dive.
All right. See you guys.
All right. Bye.